Welcome to the Conspiracy Corner. I am Jim Harold and so glad to be with you once again. And we're going to do something to use that overused quote and rip it off from Monty Python now for something completely different. We're going to talk about Discordianism and a movement that sprung out of the early 60s and had gained speed. And we're going to talk to an expert on the subject about, was this just a gigantic goof, or was there a separate meaning behind it, something very important and interesting stuff? And our guest, who is always an interesting man, is Adam Gorightly. He is the author of the book Historia Discordia, The Origins of the Discordian Society. And for over 2 decades, Adam's articles have appeared in nearly every zine, underground magazine, countercultural publication, and conspiratorial website imaginable. Bringing a mischievous sense of prankster discordianism to the zany world of fringe culture. Once he connects the dots, readers are plunged into an alternative universe and universes which forever alter their view of reality. And we're so glad to have him on the program. Adam Gorightly, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Jim. Good to talk to you again.
So for those who are not initiated or not familiar, explain to us what is, and this is it's a big question, but just tell us a little bit about the origins of Discordianism and what it is, kind of like the elevator pitch.
Probably everybody who claims to be a Discordian has a different idea of what exactly Discordianism is, but how it started was in the late 1950s in Southern California. A couple of teenagers, they've been described by friends who knew them back then as free-thinking nerds. Their names were Kerry, Thornley, and Greg Hill. And these were a couple of fellows who like to have deep philosophical conversations about all kinds of subjects on poetry, religion, politics, these type of things. And they'd often have these conversations in a bowling alley. And in one such bowling alley that tragically enough just recently closed. I think there's some works going on, some efforts to try to preserve the building. It's the Friendly Hills bowling lanes in Whittier, California. But anyway, on the night in question, they were having this philosophical conversation about, why there was so much craziness, so much chaos in the world. And they got looking at it kind of in a religious angle. You had all these different religions with all of these deities, usually male, who were trying to bring order to the universe, to the world. And Thornley and Hill basically came to the conclusion that, this was just a chaotic universe. And it was man's perception trying to put order on it, but it was there was never truly any order ever, and that they needed to come up with their own religion dedicated to chaos. Thornley brought up this idea, and Greg Hill said, "Well, there already is a deity in Greek mythology named Eris, the Greek goddess of chaos and discord. Let's start a religion dedicated to her." And thus began the very first stirrings of Discordianism way back when. And this, initially it was meant as a spoof religion. This was just between two friends. Wasn't a big movement back then, and it took many, many years before it started bubbling into the subculture, into the counterculture in the 60s and 70s, and really didn't find a larger audience until probably the mid-70s with the Illuminatus trilogy by Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea, which included in the book, which is this huge trilogy that's a kind of a conspiratorial, science fiction, surrealistic book. Included in the pages of the Illuminatus trilogy, they talked about Discordianism. And actually, the heroes of the book were Discordians, and they, throughout Illuminatus, they quoted a book called Principia Discordia, which was touted to be the Bible of Discordianism, which everybody figured at that time in the mid-70s was all made up, but actually it was based on the real book, the Principia Discordia by Kerry, Thornley, and Greg Hill, that was the Bible of Discordianism, first published in 1965 as a mere 5 copies, and there was subsequent editions of this book, all of which went on to inspire Illuminatus. And if you get on the web nowadays and do a search for Discordianism, you'll find thou- thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, scattered across the globe who can't really agree on much of anything except that they belong to the Discordian movement.
So this started off as kind of like almost, even looking at this book, looking at some of the elements, I'm reminded a little bit of like almost a very almost subversive Mad magazine. So it kind of started off as a goof, as I said initially, as a parody religion, but it sounds like maybe it has evolved into something that has a much more weight.
Well, evidently it's stuck around for this long, and there's still many, many people who profess to be Discordians. What that means, once again, we can probably get into it a little more as this interview progresses. But yeah, they were Thornley and Hill. They were influenced by Mad Magazine, and in this book, Historia Discordia, the first piece of work they collaborated on, and it's reproduced in this book, was called Apocalypse, a trade journal for doom prophets. And they produced the final issue, which was the first issue. So yeah, they were influenced by Mad Magazine, but the kind of the idea behind Discordianism was to poke fun at major religions and just kind of a vehicle to create this kind of goof that eventually led to different pranks and really over time led to a mail art project. Before we get to how it became a kind of collaborative effort between a lot of people, go back. And so they created or discovered or whatever how Discordianism came to be. That started in 1958. Once again, that bowling alley in Whittier, California. And in the Principia Discordia, the Bible of Discordians, they claimed they had a religion, or excuse me, they did have a religion, but they had a vision there one night where this chimp appeared to them holding a scroll called the Sacred Cow. That's cow spelled CHAO, as in chaos, and revealed this vision to them about Discordianism, and at that time the goddess Eris also appeared to them. And so anyway, that happened in 1958. The religion started unfolding at that period of time. In '59, Thornley basically enlisted in the Marines, and he first served at El Toro Marine Base in Southern California, where he happened to meet a fellow named Lee Harvey Oswald. And they spent a period of time together in their squadron there, a couple months, and much like Thornley engaged everybody he met in these deep philosophical conversations. Thornley was an avowed atheist, and for that period of time, he was also pretty progressive in his politics. He in a libertarian way, and so he was embracing all of this stuff. This was once again the late '50s, early '60s. So characters like Oswald fascinated him. Somebody who at the very least had an interest in Marxism, and they could discuss Marxist ideology, these type of things. So they knew each other for a couple of months. Then Thornley went to Japan and started writing a book, a novel called The Idle Warriors, which was based on being in the military during the Cold War. And the main character of this book, whose name was Johnny Shelburne, was based on Thornley and other Marines he had known during that period, including Oswald. And when Thornley got to Japan is around the time when Oswald defected to Russia. And at that point, the shift of focus for the main character in the book began became based entirely on Oswald just because of that defection. And Thornley thought, "Wow, what a great twist for the book." So that's one of the first oddities about Kerry Thornley. Discordianism notwithstanding, was that Thornley was writing a book about Oswald 3 years before the Kennedy assassination. So where Discordianism really started to heat up and get other people involved was in New Orleans in 61 after 1961. After Thornley got out of the Marines, that's where he moved to the French Quarter. He was a budding writer, so he wanted to embrace the French Quarter scene and meet all those colorful characters, and hopefully they would provide inspiration for a book or books. And during that period, he did meet a lot of colorful characters, bohemians, poets, as well as people who had connections to the underworld, and some claimed intelligence agencies and whatnot. And during that period, he met some couple of curious characters who he later suspected might have been involved in the Kennedy assassination. Remember, New Orleans in that period, in the early 60s, had that whole group of characters, David Ferry and Guy Bannister and Clay Shaw, who Jim Garrison, who was the district attorney of New Orleans at that time, Jim Garrison suspected they were part of this JFK assassination cabal, this conspiracy based out of New Orleans. So that's the period in the early 60s. So around 64, 65, Thornley, he was in New Orleans for a period of time. Then he moved to Arlington, Virginia, but his friend Greg Hill, the other co-founder of Discordianism, was off and on in New Orleans, and they made some acquaintances there, and that formed the early group of Discordians. Once again, this was just a handful of people, and in 65 they produced the first edition of the Principia Discordia, or How the West Was Lost. That's the Bible of Discordianism. And oddly enough, it was printed on, according to legend, Jim Garrison's mimeograph machine after hours by a friend of Kerry Thornley and Greg Hills by the name of Lane Kaplinger, who was a typist in Jim Garrison's office during that period. As a side note, Lane Kaplinger is the sister of another friend of Thornley's during that period in New Orleans, whose name was Grace Kaplinger. She's now known as Grace Zabrinsky, and she played Laura Palmer's mother in Twin Peaks, among other roles. She's been in a lot of things over the years. So you got all these odd connections. So this started, the first edition of the Principia Discordia, and people started getting involved as we progressed in the 60s, the likes of Robert Anton Wilson, who was working as an editor at Playboy, and Bob Shea, who was also an editor of Playboy, and a number of other writers, libertarians, progressive, anti-war. They were, came from a lot of different vectors, a lot of different ideas. People were sharing ideas, and they started collaborating through the mail. And Greg Hill started this. He'd take some clippings from a newspaper, maybe a bit of something he'd written, a collage, maybe threw some marijuana joint in there and send it along. They called these groovy packs or groovy kits. And so I would get to Robert Anton Wilson next, and he'd take something out or add something to it, and it'd get passed around, to a dozen or so Discordians across the country. This is the way people did things way before the internet, and eventually it would wind up in Greg Hill's hands again. And he used this material, which evolved over time, for subsequent editions of the Principia Discordia, which became this collaborative, somewhat psychedelic, very humorous production. Eventually, in 1970, the fourth edition of the Principia Discordia was published, and this started reaching a little bit larger of an audience, and this was, became a huge influence once again on the Illuminatus trilogy. There's all kinds of passages from Principia Discordia in that book. Now, as all of this was going on in 1967, the Summer of Love, Thornley was getting into the psychedelic movement. He was in Los Angeles now. He was editing a libertarian magazine. He was part of a mate swapping group called Carista, and so he was into sex, drugs, and all this fun stuff back then. And at that same time is when Jim Garrison launched his investigation. And during the course of that investigation, he indicted none other than Kerry Thornley as being a part of that shadowy cabal in New Orleans that was later, featured in Oliver Stone's JFK.
And it starts to get strange when you start linking or thinking that there's some link or relationship between this parody religion and possibly the JFK assassination. I know we did a whole show on Kerry Thornley about a year ago, so it is a fascinating topic. And folks, if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, I'd certainly recommend you go back and listen to it, because it's really kind of going down this really strange rabbit hole. As a lot of this is one thing I was interested in. Before I was familiar with this particular movement, I remember the first time I saw a picture of J.R. Bob Dobbs. And I wondered, who the heck is that guy? The Church of the Subgenius. What kind of relationship or debt of gratitude does the Church of the Subgenius hold to Discordianism? Seeing that it seems like there's a lot of parallels here, and even on the front of your book, I see a picture of Bob Dobbs himself. What's the relationship there, or is there one?
Well, yeah, there is, but there's also kind of a schism between Discordianism and the Church of Subgenius. And so the Church of Subgenius, I think, kind of started in the 70s and 80s, kind of became more popular or known. And Thornley actually got involved in the Church of Subgenius, and at one time or another, one of the founders of the Subgenius movement, Ivan Stang, described Thornley as one of the early saints, one of the Church of Subgenius. Later, they had some type of falling out, and so that's when the schism occurred, I think. And but for sure, yeah, it definitely seems like Discordianism was an influence to one degree or another to the Subgenius movement, and there's definitely some overlap there as well. If you look at a lot of the imagery, like the cover of the book, Historia Discordia, which was actually created during that period in the early to mid 80s by a fellow named Raldo. So you can see during that period, they were definitely influencing each other, the Discordianism and the Subgenius.
Are there some central tenets? Now, they might be, ridiculous. For example, on the front of here of this book, I see this, and I love this actually. Think for yourself, schmuck. I mean, are there like a equivalent to the 10 Commandments or something for Discordianism? Again, with its roots firmly planted in cheek, but maybe some actual beliefs that have come out of this, some guide stones for people who would want to follow the Discordianism path?
Probably none other than believe nothing, trust no one. They kind of start from that point where they're making fun of organized religion, and but during the early days of Discordianism, when Greg Hill and Kerry Thornley were putting all this together, there was more of a organized doctrine, and they could ordain popes into the Discordian society. By the late 60s, Greg Hill thought, this is stupid. Anybody who wants to be a Discordian pope at any time, anywhere, can declare themselves as such. So that was kind of the tenet of Discordianism as it moved in, psychedelic 60s. As far as Church of Subgenius, they seem, even though it's obvious they are poking fun at everybody and every religion, they are a little bit more structured and rigid as far as membership in the Church of Subgenius. So there's definitely different way of doing things there. But as far as similarities, I don't know if there's like the Commandments or any commandments they share. But once again, it's just this light-hearted look at different religions, and both Discordianism and Subgenius are avenues, vehicles to poke fun at sacred cows.
Now, what has been the reaction? I can only imagine. And you talked about Garrison, for example, the thought that maybe Thornley was somehow in this weave of the cabal to assassinate President Kennedy. But from other mainstream figures, churches, and so forth, what has been the reaction or the interaction with Discordianism and its adherents?
With other main, you saying what are the
In other words, how has the mainstream reacted to Discordianism? Has it pretty much ignored it, or has there been some points of contention?
I don't think Discordianism has ever really been on the radar of any mainstream religion. It's always that undercurrent that's been there, that's continued to grow over the years. And once again, I mentioned, if you look on the internet, there's hundreds of thousands of Discordians, it seems, based all around the world in other countries. In fact, there's a young guy writing a book called Chasing Eris, who traveled around the world and interviewed somewhere around probably 100 Discordians all across the planet. So, they exist, they're there, but once again, it's an undercurrent. I've never heard any any mainstream religion discuss Discordianism really, except yeah, none really during in the Discordians back in the day certainly tried to rattle the cages like of the John Birch Society and people in the religious right, and so there was some interaction there. But once again, Discordianism has pretty much stayed under the radar for the most part, even though it's continued to thrive all these years in its own weird way. But one of the main doctrines or mottos of Discordianism goes, "We Discordians must stick apart." So there's no internal structural thing any Discordians are required to agree upon. It's basically, and every Discordian, I guess I can consider myself a Discordian. We all have different ways of viewing what Discordianism is. For me, it's just a way of embracing the chaos that is out there, and using that in a positive fashion, harnessing, channeling that energy in a creative fashion, because we can't deny that really chaos is all about us. And as Thornley and Hill mused back in the day, it's just basically mankind's perception that have tried to order this truly a chaotic universe we live in. They had a way of looking at it, and you might, looking at on the cover of Historia Discordia, you'll see the round symbol that is like a yin and yang.
Yes.
Based on that, it's called the sacred cow, and it depicts the hodge and podge of Discordianism. And so you have, and it's basically based on the apple in the mythology, but on one side of the yin yang, or the hodge and podge they call it, you'll see the golden apple with a K on it, and on the other side you'll see the pentagon. So this represents the two forces of chaos in the pentagon. That's like the aneuristic, which is negative chaos, and the golden apple is the heuristic, or the positive forces of chaos, and these counterbalance against each other in this what Greg Hill called this hodgepodge that forms this religious symbol of Discordianism. So it's kind of a deep concept if you think about it, that in Gnosticism and these other religions where it's you constantly have the powers of light and darkness balancing against one another, and that's just kind of the nature of the universe. You need the dark with the light, the yin with the yang, and the hodge with the podge.
Do you think that these two young men who were in a bowling alley and kind of cooked this up as a maybe in many ways a joke and a reaction to what they felt were things that were wrong with society? Do you think it's had really a far-reaching effect, not in the sense necessarily that Discordianism is a household word, but many of the concepts have kind of bled through and have impacted society? Do you think those two young men had a impact that maybe even they didn't realize?
Oh, definitely, yeah, and they had an impact on the '60s counterculture, but once again, they're not household names. But ultimately, the Discordians were just basically saying what a lot of people in the '60s were saying was to question authority and come up with your own ideas of how to live. In the society as it was emerging during that period. And yeah, I guess saying Discordianism was a huge influence on the Illuminatus trilogy, which once again was one of those is kind of not didn't become a huge success, but there was a subculture that are crazy about Robert Anton Wilson and the Illuminatus trilogy, and that was the first book that really looked. In depth at conspiracy theory and how that molds a culture, and looking at those type of things. And there's certain things connected with Discordianism, like the number 23. Is a holy number in Discordianism, and that's a concept that there's some magical property or synchronicity surrounding the number 23 that it's one of those things that are it's just kind of out there in the culture that Discordianism was responsible for, but really nobody knows what Discordianism is. So it's uh, yeah, once again, it's just kind of this underground current that has continued to bubble along over the year, and I think influence different subcultures.
Well, as a fan of LeBron James, I am all for
Oh, there
the
you go.
the
Yeah,
holy impact, and of course Michael Jordan before him.
yeah.
The mystique about number 23.
I had written a tongue-in-cheek conspiracy essay one time, and I didn't save it. But yeah, it was talking about the magical properties of the number 23, and this was before LeBron, but it
Right,
was when
Michael Jordan.
Michael was playing, and of course Magic Johnson was number 32,
Aha!
and so he,
He was kind of like the antithetical to it, or something.
yeah, yeah. But
Antithesis.
I was also a big Magic Johnson fan, but yeah, but so yeah, I wanted to mention one of the the Discordians were big on pranks, and boy, you can see what's this was way before the internet, and of course, trolling is such a big thing now. And there's a lot of Discordians out there that are kind of weird trolls as well. So there's some negative impacts to all of this, but Discordians were into pranks, back in the day, and these were often pretty lighthearted. The intent was just to get people to think, perhaps enlighten somebody with some message they'd send in the mail. And they started a thing called part of Operation Mind. Uh, can I use blue language? I forgot.
Yes, yes, yes. I know what you're going to say. Go ahead.
Part of this thing they started called Operation Mindfuck was called Project Jake, and they'd alert. At this time there was a couple dozen, 3 dozen Discordians across the U.S., and so they'd start something called a Jake, and they'd say on a certain date, let's bombard this editor at a newspaper with different letters designed around this concept, and so And, so on that appointed date, this editor or whoever it was would open up his mailbox and get hundreds of letters from people with weird names. Of course, Discordians all adopted different strange names and stuff. And so, that was one of the outgrowths of Operation Mindfuck. But Operation Mindfuck, or the abbreviation OM, was started during this whole Garrison investigation thing, and when Thornley was being targeted by Garrison. And at that time, Garrison had all these, not only his own staff, but all these independent investigators who descended on New Orleans and came up with all these different theories that they threw at Garrison. Oftentimes, Garrison would take them and throw them and see if they stuck against the wall. And one of the crazier theories was by this guy named Alan Chapman, who was kind of associated with the John Birch Society. And Chapman believed that the Bavarian Illuminati was behind the Kennedy assassination. And Thornley heard about this and thought it was hilarious. And that started the first phase of OM, where Thornley designed this phony letterhead that said the Bavarian Illuminati, the world's oldest and most successful conspiracy. And he adopted the name of Omar Khayyam Ravenhurst, and all the other Discordians came up with their Discordian Illuminati names. So they started sending these fake letters, and you can see a lot of these in the book Historia Discordia. They started sending a lot of these fake letters to different people, including Jim Garrison, claiming that yes, the Illuminati is here, but we're not involved in the assassination. We've come to enlighten you, or something like that. And so, once again, Robert Anton Wilson and they all adopt these names. Were taking part in the, they were sending similar letters to the John Birch Society and people in the religious right, but also occasionally people in the counterculture movement as well, who they felt were taking themselves too seriously. And all of this, once again, worked its way into the Illuminatus trilogy, where you have this battle of the Discordians against the Illuminati in that trilogy. And as it turns out at the end of the book, really the Illuminatis and Discordianisms were kind of one and the same. There was overlaps, and although they were kind of working at times against each other, they were also ultimately working together to bring some sort of change in consciousness or something like that.
Well, it is fascinating, although I must admit, after reading up on this a little bit, I had a little bit of a headache. But but I really I thought this quote kind of encapsulates it. If you want in on the Discordian Society, then declare yourself what you wish. Do what you like and tell us about it. Or if you don't, or if you prefer, don't. I think that kind of encapsulates it. It is interesting, though, and interesting to see how maybe some of these concepts have percolated through society over the years, and maybe kind of encourage some folks to think on their own. Where can people find out more about this movement, the history of this movement, and certainly where can they find the book?
There is a website dedicated to all this craziness, where a lot of the material that didn't end up in the book you can find on this website, constantly adding new content. And it's called, appropriately enough, historiadiscordia.com. And the book itself, yeah, it's available on Amazon, and that's probably the best place to go. There's also a link on the website. I should mention, with Discordianism, has this long history with synchronicities. Robert Anton Wilson discovered this back in the day, and he writes a lot about synchronicities in his books. And so my journey in all of this started in the late 90s and the year 2000, where I was kicking around the idea of writing a book on Kerry Thornley, not because of the Discordian connections. I didn't know a whole lot about Discordianism back then, but because of all this stuff related to the Garrison investigation and Thornley's role or supposed role in different conspiracies. And so and I knew a little bit about the Discordian angle, and so it was in mid 2000. I got an email from a guy named Bob Newport, and
Hmm.
it came at an email address, and I've told this story many times, that was just a private email address. I didn't use it, as far as my writing career or anything. Only a handful of people knew that address, and Bob Newport shouldn't have really known the address because he didn't really know who I was, or I didn't know who he was. Maybe somehow we're still trying to figure it out, but we'll never know how he knew to contact me. But anyway, his email, the first email I got from him, said basically stated that Greg Hill, the co-founder of Discordianism, died. And this was in July of 2000. I went, Once again, how do you know how to contact me? That's interesting. Anyway, emailed him back and said, "Hey, did you know Kerry Thornley as well? I'm considering writing a book on Thornley." And
Hmm.
he emailed back and said, "Yes, I went to high school with both Thornley and Greg Hill. I'm the third uh, founding member of Discordianism." I went, wow, that's that's a trip. Anyway, that dialogue with Bob Newport continued over the years, and I met him a couple of years later when I interviewed Robert Anton Wilson. And Newport at that time brought what he called the Discordian archives, which were a handful of material. And he let me borrow them, and I took them home, and scanned them, and later used them in that first book. Some of the stuff in the first book, the Prankster and the Conspiracy. And I asked Newport at that time, "Hey, I'd like to maybe eventually make a book on the history of Discordianism. If you're cool with me using scans of the material he shared with me." And he was always cool with that. So time progressed over years, and I was getting more serious around 2008, 2009
Hmm.
about moving forward with this project. So I contacted him and said, "Hey, you still cool with it?" And he gave the thumbs up. He was the holder of the material at that point, and he said, "The next time you're down in L.A., stop by and I'll give you everything." And I didn't know what everything meant, but so yeah, I went, and this was in like August of 2009. Uh, Went to see him. Cool guy, very synchronistic, magical fellow himself. And he passed on to me several boxes upon boxes all of these Discordian archives, which were Greg Hill's archives that he passed on to Newport, that would have ended up in a dumpster if Newport hadn't rescued them. And
Right.
it was at that time I asked him once again, "Well, how did you know to contact me way back when?" And he said, "I have no idea. I have no memory how that all came about." So that's kind of an ongoing mystery. I just kind of
Huh.
stumbled into all of this. So that's one of there was other synchronicities related to the book as well. So tapped into some type of weirdness here, and been kind of riding this wave here, and felt it was my duty to get this material out there into the world. So yeah, you can find it in the three books: Prankster and the Conspiracy, Historia Discordia, and the last one we talked about, Caught in the Crossfire, are all part of kind of dawned on me a Discordian trilogy. And there probably will be a couple more Discordian books. There's more material that hopefully letters and such I want to get into print. And once again, the Astoria Discordia website, where I've been posting tons of stuff as well, because never get around to getting all of this material in books. So I want to get it out there to the public and people who are into this stuff. 'Cause there is a diehard subculture who are crazy about this type of material related to Discordianism and Robert Anton Wilson and the other people involved with it.
Well, Adam Gorightly, we thank you for joining us today on the Conspiracy Corner and continued success in your pursuits.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for having me on.
And thank you for listening. And whatever it is that you believe, I hope that you have a good time pursuing those those threads, and for those that believe nothing, and some of those who believe in other things that we talk about on these programs. But we always thank you for keeping an open mind, and that's the thing about this. I love to talk to different people with different thoughts. Probably a lot of people who listen to this are 180 degrees opposed to something like Discordianism, but that's why we do this, because we want to get all the ideas out there and let you decide for yourself, and we appreciate your time. And we'll talk to you next time on Conspiracy Corner. Have a great week, everybody.